Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous materials on the topic of my special order.
Without objection.
I rise today to draw attention to wildfires and forest management. Recent headlines show that our forests are in terrible shape. 8.8 million acres have burned this year. $250 million recently were transferred from forest management accounts to fight fires announced last week. Emergency fire spending has already topped $700 million this year and is still growing. We have a problem that is greatly decreasing and impairing the value of our forest for the next generation. I worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass House Resolution 2647, the Resilient Federal Forest Act, back in July. This bill was supported from Maine to Alaska by Democrats and Republicans. This bill ends the destructive practice of fire borrowing in a fiscally responsible manner. It creates a sub under the Stafford Act for wildfire. This ensures that resources to put out major fires are available when necessary. This week, the Obama administration publicly called on the Congress to fix fire borrowing. While I appreciate the President's interest, agree with him that we need to fix fire borrowing, and applaud the 19 Democrats who voted for House Resolution 2647 that fixes fire borrowing, fixing fire borrowing alone won't solve the problem. Fixing fire borrowing alone simply is treating a symptom instead of a disease. It's like putting on a Band-Aid without cleaning out the wound. Again, the House passed this bipartisan legislation back in July. We could be fixing these problems now, but the Senate hasn't acted. It's time for the Senate to act, and it's time to stop playing politics with our nation's forest, one of our most treasured resources. The House offered a solution. Let's embrace constructive governance and make House Resolution 2647 the law of the land. I want to take a moment and look at what the Resilient Federal Forest Act does. We already talked about fire borrowing, but it also prevents future fires. H.R. 2647 gives the Forest Service the tools it needs to better manage our national forest immediately after its passage. Our forests are overgrown, and therefore they are fire-prone. Fighting fires doesn't prevent future fires. That's why we need better management. Scientific thinning helps prevent future fires. I'd like to show some photographs from a forest in my home state of Arkansas. To some, this may look like a healthy, thriving forest because you see trees and you see a lot of greenery, but I'm a forest. Look at that. I see an overstocked stand of trees. I see too much undergrowth. I see too much dead and dying material on the forest floor. This is not a healthy forest, but this happens to be a control site in the middle of a healthy forest. And next, I want to show how we get to a healthy forest on this particular site. This area has been thinned, and there's controlled burns taking place. This is done on intervals of 3 to 5 years when these burns take place. And they not only make the forest better to withstand potential forest fires, they also create better wildlife habitat. The biodiversity in this forest goes through the roof when these kind of management practices are put in place. We get healthy trees. We get an early successional habitat that's good for wildlife. It also is good for the soil. It's good for water quality, and it's good for air quality. And this last picture shows what a healthy forest in my district looks like. These trees are thriving. This is an early growth, not too long after a fire. This is great wildlife habitat. The biodiversity of wildlife and plant life is much higher in this photograph than what we saw in the previous photograph. This creates a win-win situation. Now, this isn't the solution for everywhere across the country. This is what works in my district, on the forest in my district. But there are forest managers across this country that know how to manage their forest in their particular climate, in their particular setting, to create healthy forests and forests that can withstand a fire. It would be almost impossible for a forest fire to destroy these trees. The next thing that this Resilient Federal Forest Act does is it stops frivolous lawsuits. And you may ask, why do we need to stop frivolous lawsuits? Well, frivolous lawsuits hinder forest plans that are developed locally using science, best management practices, and collaborative efforts that represent stakeholder values. The end result is a forest that is decreased and impaired in value for our next generation. This bill discourages frivolous lawsuits by requiring those suing to stop collaborative projects to post a bond. If the plaintiff loses, they pay the taxpayers' legal bills. If they win, they get their money back. This bill also aids in better land management planning. In the words of former U.S. Forest Service Chief Dale Bosworth, we do not have a fire problem on our nation's forest. We have a land management problem, and it needs to be addressed quickly. Delayed decision-making, or even worse, no decision-making at all, is hurting our forest. You see, forests are dynamic. They're a living, growing organism. When we say no action, we're actually taking action. Since forests are not static, scientific analysis should not be static. This bill requires the Forest Service to critically analyze the impacts of no action, which often are overgrowth, increased wildfire, and diseases. Increases in future wildfire problems are often caused because of poor land management. It makes it difficult for reforestation, ultimately decreasing and impairing the value of forest. This bill sets up requirements for salvage plans in response to catastrophic events. It requires environmental assessments for salvage projects to be completed within 90 days so that timber can be removed while it is still commercially valuable. The USDA completed Katrina NEPA on DeSoto National Forest within 90 days. They expedited it and they were successful at that. And as a result, 80% of the timber was salvaged that was moderate to heavily damaged areas. The management actions laid out in this bill must comply with forest plans. It's not taking a shortcut. Despite what some folks say, this doesn't mean thousands of acres of clear cuts. It doesn't mean destruction of snag habitats that are often become available after a large fire. In my home state, clear cuts are restricted to 180 acres at most. We're talking about thousands of acres of land that still have to follow forest management practices. This bill rewards collaboration. It incentivizes collaboration. It speeds up the implementation of collaborative projects. It safeguards a strong, timely environmental review process through categorical exclusions for forest management projects. You may ask, what are collaborative projects? This is simply where local land managers, environmentalists, citizens, and industry representatives come up with a plan. These groups spend hundreds, if not thousands, of hours working on a plan that's best for their local area. Why wouldn't we encourage this sort of compromise? This bill encourages more collaborative projects. Passing this bill shows that we endorse common sense plans that tend to local and ecological needs. This bill creates greater reforestation after natural disasters. As a forester, this statistic is really disturbing to me. On average, less than 3% of an area is reforested after a catastrophic event on our national forest. This bill requires that 70% reforestation takes place within 5 years. This will revitalize our forests that are destroyed by fire or other natural events. When we reforest an area, we have young trees that grow fast and sequester carbon faster than older, fully grown trees. If we sequester more carbon, then we should be planting more trees. We should demand that we reforest our land after it's destroyed, after the timber is destroyed in one of these catastrophic events. We have to stop playing politics, and we need to pass this bill. This bill creates greater roles for the tribes. The federal government does not collaborate and work together with those who have expertise in forest health oftentimes. This bill brings in state and tribal governments as strong partners in forest management. It gives the Forest Service the authority to accept assistance from states willing to put money toward forest management. It also reinforces existing tribal authority to assist in the management of national forest lands adjacent to reservations. The Resilient Federal Forest Act modernizes secure rural schools. This is an issue that's very important in my district. We have many rural areas near our national forest, and the schools are hurting because of the decreased funding because we're not keeping our forest healthy. Rural communities not only depend on our forest for their sustenance, but they also provide emergency services, education, and support for the forest and residents who live near the forest. As forests lose value, communities suffer and will only suffer more in the future. This bill gives counties flexibility to spend secure rural schools funding. It allows them to spend money on emergency services on federal lands, and it puts 25% of stewardship contracts into the county treasury where the projects occurred. This bill means more money for our schools and public services, along with the benefits of a healthy and resilient forest. One more time, I want to look at the fire borrowing issue. This is one of the worst fire seasons we have seen. We know what good management practices are. We know how to implement those practices on the land. The House has acted by passing H.R. 2647, the Resilient Federal Forest Act. It solves fire borrowing. It completely reforms current bad management practices. And this isn't just me saying this. We have letters from hundreds of groups that have endorsed this bill. Here's a list of just a few of them. The Forest Products Industry National Labor Management Committee, the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, the National Association of Counties, the National Association of Forest Service Retirees, the National Water Resources Association, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America. And there's hundreds more that have supported this legislation because it's good, common sense legislation that is good for our country, it's good for our forest. The House has acted. It's time for the Senate to act. It's time for the administration to stop playing politics with wildfire. It's time to make House Resolution 2647 the law of the land.